Welcome to one of the biggest shows of all time, and truly a driving force behind the obsession that a lot of people had with police procedurals back in the day, or as we like to call them around here, how to trick your audience into thinking that it's actually okay when the cops break the rules and do ethically questionable abusive stuff. CSI. Crime scene investigation, and in today's video we're doing our own little bit of crime scene investigation as we talk about the choices made by this show to include a trans character in its early seasons and what went wrong with that. And to be clear, it's mostly wrong. I'm sure at some point in this period of the channel when I obsess over cop shows and trans people on them, we will find a decent episode that humanizes our struggles without turning us into effectively pitiable misery porn, but today is not gonna be that day. No, see, CSI in this initial outing during Season 2's episode 13, Identity Crisis, a title which should be raising a hell of a lot of alarms for anyone watching, well, they kind of engage with all the worst stereotypes about trans people that seem to be derived almost perfectly from Silence of the Lambs, the painting of our community in the light of psychotic serial killers, whose motivations are very heavily intertwined with their genderqueer character.
It rubs the lotion on its skin. It does this whenever it's told.
All of which goes a long way to feeding the fear of trans people as monsters. However, CSI does something a little different here. A little different enough that it does sort of stand out as kind of a landmark episode for trans representation as mentally ill villains. Namely, that the character at the heart of all this is a trans man. Yeah, look at that. It's not just trans women getting on that terrible, terrible train. We all get to suffer here. So, with the little bit of spoilers done to hopefully hook you into watching the rest of this video, let's get into it and find out more about the arch nemesis of our main character Gil Grissom, Paul Millander.
Happy birthday, Mr. Grissom.
Okay, actually, before we get into Identity Crisis, I just quickly want to get you up to speed on what we've seen so far of Paul Millander from Season 1, because this is a somewhat recurring character. He is basically linked to a bunch of suicides, and his father died from a supposed suicide, and we get a bunch of stuff that reveals all the suicides that keep happening around Paul Millander are actually being caused by him and being staged in a certain way to fit their serial killer modus operandi, I guess. And Paul Millander does a bunch of funky little tricks on the main gang and plays that often seen role of a super intelligent killer who toys with the police department that hunts them down. That's basically all you really need to know for our setup here, and now we can actually begin where that story ends off.
Pete Walker, California.
So we begin with another one of these suicide murders happening, in the weirdest way possible as the show goes out of its way to have somebody be as creepy as they can in the opening scenes. Like, I don't know, if someone acted like this around people in real life, I don't think anyone would go near them at all or invite them into their car, but this finally gets our CSI team to figure out some facts about Paul Millander, and what he is doing here with his serial killer spree. Namely, that he is targeting middle-aged men whose birthdays are on the anniversary of his own father's faked suicide murder death. It's daddy issues, and that's a statement that is only going to keep and maintain relevance as we go on. Trust me, it's daddy issues all the way down. And I sure hope you love trans men's identity being tied to some problems with their dad not being around, or them tying up some masculinity obsession with that, because that's what it's doing.
Kills men whose birthdays are on the anniversary of his father's murder.
In descending order.
It's the little things that build a comprehensive way of stereotyping trans people after all. So we can basically skip through a bunch of the investigation period at the start because there isn't a huge amount here that ties into that trans aspect that we actually care about. It's just the squad trying to figure out how to catch the dude and solve the case, while also creating some more links between Paul and his focus of attention, Gil Grissom.
I call it good versus evil.
He's telling me he's gonna show me both sides.
There is one little hint that comes up, that a planted hair at the crime scene for them to find is suspected of being Paul's, and then this gets quickly disproved by the genetics lab due to the fact that the hair's follicle is XX chromosome, and therefore clearly not from a man like Paul, right? A man-man, a manly man-man who's a man.
Could be Millander's.
Well, that's impossible. The amylogenin on the follicle came back XX.
We obviously all know the secret suspended reason for this, but the audience at the time was presumably taken along for the ride with the rest of the CSI team that this hair belonged to some random third person who was a woman. Also, can you DNA check hair? I'm no scientist, but it sounds vaguely true, and yet again, we see here how having an understanding of trans people existing can affect a case. Because if you knew trans people were a thing, then you would not completely write off that the hair was Paul Millander's, and maybe even do some of that research and investigating to see if it's possible that this might be a trans man.
Okay, so what's he trying to tell us? That he used to kill women?
Then that would remove the big transphobic twist from this criminal show episode, and I guess that would sadden a few writers who seem to find it incredibly fun to shove in shock gender reveals for their police procedurals. Every crime show has sort of done something like this. It's almost a rite of passage at this point, much like the terrible lighting that all the shows from this time period seem to have. Like, god fucking damn it, I'm amazed that anyone in the CSI world can see what is happening because of how bland the colour tone is. Seriously, show people. This is a nightmare to see. Finally though, 20 minutes into the episode and a bunch of random esoteric crime mumble later on, our two protagonists find Paul Millander and figure out how he was tracking all these people who had a very specific birthday. It turns out that he had created a second life for himself as a traffic court judge and was using the trials to find middle-aged men's birthdays. I mean, heck, we all have to have some kind of hobby to keep ourselves going through the long days of living, and this whole idea of Paul so successfully creating a life for himself as a new, different man is something that is going to play a larger part of the bigger story about his whole transness. Like, he can so readily do it because he already did the work of creating a man to become before.
You may be seated.
There's a funny scene where Paul Millander contempts the crime lab people as they make a big scene in his courtroom about him.
I'll have you removed from this courtroom and charged with contempt.
He's wanted in Clark County for murder.
You are now in contempt of court.
And then he approaches Gil in the jail cell that he put him in, and tries to claim that this Paul Millander is a doppelganger of him, and that he is just some poor random judge who's getting mistaken for a criminal. I mean, it makes a lot of sense for Paul to do this, because without a DNA test, they can't really prove that he's the same guy. But then, much like all serial killers, he gets cocky and invites Gil to come over to his house to meet his wife. He also touches the bars of the jail, which lets the cops get his prints, and so they can do tests to find out that he is the same guy. I mean, it's a bunch of stuff that just sort of drags out everything to keep the episode going. Something that I've definitely never been guilty of. I totally don't have random tangents occasionally that seem to really piss people off. And, you know, I'm not adding extra minutes onto any videos that I make. Shut up. Anyways, the hair has some extra details on it, namely that the woman who it belonged to had been taking a bunch of supplements and hormones that the people in the lab posit might have been to boost athletic performance or to increase sex drives. You know, the two major reasons that any female-bodied person would take testosterone. I can't possibly think of another one, and, well, honestly, neither can these medical people. Being trans really was like an invisibility cloak back in the day, according to these shows. People had absolutely no idea and would ignore all the obvious signs pointing towards it in favor of increasingly wackier and wackier alternative answers. It's actually sort of an interesting unintentional point towards how trans identity is something that many cis audiences had no idea about and had no real connection to. That almost no amount of evidence would make cis people think such a thing because they just didn't have the familiarity to make that leap of logic, despite the blaring obviousness of it. A lack that I think also impacts trans-closeted people as well, because without that knowledge, it's quite hard to make the decision to transition and to question your gender. Without the tools, it's like trying to swim in lava. And unfortunately, for all those cis audiences, the things they had which give them examples of trans people back in the day were shows like this one, and Law and Order, and House, and, well, you name a show, there is a reasonably high chance that the representation is not gonna be positive, or is gonna be so full of stereotypes that it creates an incredibly incorrect and monolithic version of trans people in the heads of those who have nothing else to combat that representation.
But he has cancer.
It's why, as much as we need good representation right now, we also need to analyse and criticise negative representation to better dismantle the transphobia that has served to subconsciously encourage and cement itself in the minds of its audience. Yes, I am trying to justify my entire fucking channel. Look, we've got at least another year or two of me doing this before I'm happy to release the final opinion on trans representation in media, so let's keep this ball rolling for another year or two, right? Gil and Paul get to have their little Hannibal, Red Dragons, Silence of the Lambs face-off, the classic situation of a super intelligent serial killer and the person chasing them, having polite conversations in settings that are merely a facade over the horrifying reality of the serial killer.
Can't be too safe out there, can we, Mr. Grissom?
No, we can't.
We learn that Paul, as the Judge Craig Mason, has not just a wife, but he also has some of the worst wallpaper and interior decorations I've ever fucking seen in my life. Jesus Christ, you're one of the trans people, okay? Get better at decorating. I mean, actually, sorry. He has a child, a young boy, which goes some way towards further distracting the audience from putting the trans twist together. A distraction which is further aided by the CSI team getting obsessed with trying to prove that Judge Mason is in fact Paul Millander, despite the physical evidence of his prints not supporting them.
You're never gonna believe who Judge Mason's fingerprints match. Judge Mason.
The cops find Paul's mother, though, and through her we start to really get the puzzle pieces coming together. Only 30 minutes deep into the episode, because CSI believes in the slow burn, I suppose. Puzzle pieces that are really cemented by how much the mum refuses to gender the child who would become Paul Millander. We also learn that the Paul Millander identity is basically just a direct copy of Paul's father, like he has the same name and he had the same job in the previous episodes, and we see that whole daddy issue thing from earlier when it comes to the reasoning behind this. And then one of our cops finds the room of Pauline, a very pink and very effeminate room filled with pictures of them in dresses that starts to build some kind of Psycho-esque case for once the big twist is revealed. You know, all the best transphobic episodes are really working from the truly stellar and groundbreaking efforts of Psycho and Silence of the Lambs as far as hammering home the idea of genderqueer or genderqueer-esque characters as psychotic monsters with terrible childhoods. The mum, who doesn't really seem to be that with it to be honest, claims that Pauline died a long time ago, and then when pressed about her son Paul, tells the cops to leave, because I guess she doesn't really have the bandwidth to explain to them whatever the fuck was going on in their family home, leading the police to believe that Paul and Pauline are separate people, and that Paul killed his sister Pauline.
So, Paul Millander killed his sister?
It's plausible. It's not provable.
It's actually kind of crazy by this point how much these people in CSI are doing the job of just not addressing the fact of the trans element of Paul Millander. Like, holy shit, I get wanting to turn it into a big shock moment, but this is getting ridiculous. These are police officers. They're meant to be at least kind of, in these propaganda shows, good at their jobs. Finally, the lab people reveal the fact that Paul planted his own hair at the crime scene, to the shocked and kind of disgusted faces of the criminal lab people, and they mention that Paul had a sex change at some point.
Why?
My theory? Sex change?
Now, nobody says any of the transphobic slur words that you might come to expect, but they do get awfully confusing with referring to Paul Millander and this whole trans sex change. Like, continually talking about it as if he murdered Pauline to become Paul, which is some grade A cis people bullshit that really feeds the attitudes of parents who feel hostility towards their trans kids, as if that trans kid killed the child they really loved and replaced them. Like, nah, this ain't some fairy bullshit, that's the same fucking child. It's still your kid, and get the fuck over it without falling into some bizarre language about how the child you really liked is dead, because that's traumatic fucking shit to drop on someone you supposedly love. Stop traumatizing your trans kids. CSI, for a show that has a lot of biology-based keywords in its scripts, also does the Family Guy-esque presentation of transitioning, having Pauline go into an elevator as a woman and then come out basically immediately as a full man. Something which really ignores the fact that transitioning is a process that takes time and effort and investment to go through, and isn't just wham bam sex change, thank you, I'm no longer a man.
Wonder how long it's gonna take.
It's a minor thing in the grand scheme of the transphobia at the heart of what is going on here, and will be revealed further as we get through the last 10 minutes of this episode, but it is still very much worth bringing up, because it yet again is all part of that feeding misconceptions about us. It all builds an incorrect version of trans lives and the trans community in cis people's minds that can make it difficult for real trans people down the road when they have to butt heads with a stereotypical version of them that just isn't and cannot be true. We learn that Mrs. Millander kicked her son out when he transitioned because he apparently came back as a weird man that she didn't recognize, and the show then immediately reminds us that this guy killed 3 people and is faking his identity as a judge, all of which sort of goes a long way to reinforcing her opinion that something is deeply wrong with her transitioned child, and the wrongness is in some way linked to the sex change and the being trans.
Pauline went away and came back a very strange man.
That your son has murdered 3 people.
Though, I have to hand out a little bit of kudos where it's due, and don't worry, the show doesn't get much but gets this one. They do at least keep calling Paul her son. It ain't much, but at least it's limited misgendering so far from the CSI team. Now we move to the scene that makes or breaks the episode for being transphobic. The big confrontation between Gil Grissom and Paul Millander in the interrogation room, when all the cards are supposedly on the table and they know the facts about Paul's past. It's time to find out from the horse's mouth why he kills middle-aged men, and for CSI's sake, it sure better hope it hasn't made this trans man into someone who transitioned for murder reasons or ulterior motives.
When you used to be Pauline.
Paul immediately reveals a further complication in this gender discussion because it turns out that he is intersex and dealt with a mismatch between chromosomes and bodily development, a mismatch that led his parents to argue over how he should present, with his mum favouring the girl option and his dad favouring the boy option, leading to them having Paul be a girl at home and a boy outside of the home. Already, we need to immediately pump the brakes on this one, and discuss some shit here about intersex kids and the situation, because CSI sure as fuck doesn't give one hell about trying to do anything more with this than have it be an additional twist on the twist pie that they have made for their gender-fucky serial killer to, scare and freak out the cis audience with their bizarre strangeness.
You were a girl when you were inside the house, and a boy when you were out in the world.
See, what we deal with here is a problem that arises from trying to force someone into a binary system that their body doesn't necessarily match. A forcefulness that of course leads to some mental issues down the line thanks to what effectively amounts to abuse and trauma just for being who they are. The real world is not so blatantly binary man-woman as certain societies would like you to believe that it is. And so, being more open to letting these kinds of people discover themselves without interference goes a long way to letting intersex people have happy, fulfilling lives without the feeling that they are desperately wrong or in need of fixing. It's especially rough with how many intersex kids deal with dangerous non-consensual cosmetic surgeries or medical interventions to try and make them match whichever binary gender the doctors or their parents have determined that they should be. A choice that tries to negate their intersex identity and can lead to medical complications and horrors down the line. Becoming a serial killer, though, is not the most common outcome of the situation, funnily enough, and the fact that a lot of cis audiences and cis media will only really get their fill of intersex identities through shows like this goes a long way to explaining why that community, much like the trans one, deals with very similar shitty stereotypes. In the interest of the gender conversation, the conversation about whether Paul Millander is actually a trans man or not based on this biological and social history, it actually, weirdly enough, doesn't matter, except to be a case of how both the I and the T in LGBTQIA are gonna get boned here because they sort of get melded together and confused by people. Okay, let's continue. So, we get told that a big deciding factor behind Paul doing all that he has done is seeing what happened to his father, and making the internal logical leap that if he had been a boy at that time, then he could have saved his dad.
A boy could have saved his father.
Yeah. See, I said that there was going to be daddy issues at the heart of this, but I bet you hadn't thought that the whole reasoning behind Paul transitioning into a man and choosing that gender identity was just because of the assumption that masculinity would have allowed him to stop his father being killed. I mean, Paul is presented to us here in the show as crazy, as a psycho serial killer who doesn't live in the same world as the rest of us in regards to how he reasons his way through things. Like, there was no way that a 10-year-old was going to be able to fight off adults in that situation, regardless of if you were a boy or a girl, unless being a boy would have given you magical access to a pocket dimension with a fucking gun in it. And yet, the issue that we have here is that so much of that presentation of Paul as just a mentally unwell monster is also tied up a bunch in his revealed intersex and trans identity too. Like, there's no real effort done to dismantle or unentangle all that complexity, and so CSI comes away basically just lumping two big parts of the queer community into the crazy camp, and calling it a day at, well, that's a serial killer, what can you do?
Why are you smiling?
I am comfortable.
I mean, I want to say it again to make it clear as well, that it's also transphobic to showcase someone going to a clinic to get a sex change and taking hormones and transitioning specifically because they want to get tough, and they see the only way of becoming tough as being a man. Like, for all intents and purposes, Paul isn't a trans man or part of the trans community because his reasoning for transitioning is not one that aligns with a sense of gender dysphoria or gender euphoria like we would kind of expect it to be. He is in fact doing it more for the reasons that the TERFs seem to think a lot of trans men transition. Because apparently they're all being pressured into it by society telling them that being a woman isn't good enough, and they see security in becoming a man. Yeah, that's right, all those radical feminists, radically aligning feminism with far-right and extremist Christian ideology. You've all got very similar views to this ancient propaganda episode who views trans and intersexness as a funky little twist to throw in and use to make a creepy character into a mentally ill creepy character with a kinda tragic backstory who gets to freak out the cis people. What a truly illustrious crowd of people engaging with that kind of rhetoric, huh?
I went to the clinic. I became a man.
Doesn't get much more powerful than that.
And that's pretty much where the episode ends for us in regards to any kind of gender discussion. Paul escapes from custody, and then him and Gil have a big showdown in the very dark, poorly lit sets of CSI back at Paul's childhood home, where he's killed his mother, and then we find that Paul had actually killed himself in the bathtub, the final death as part of his big mentally ill master plan of, I guess, coming full circle. The final thing the show rests on is a birth certificate of Paul Millander, showing their dead name of Pauline and their ex-gender of female, and that's that.
I've lost hope.
Now, I think it's fair to say that the two words I would use to describe this sort of trans representation, because despite everything we've said, it effectively aligns with a lot of trans identity and the ways that trans identity was showcased at the time of this episode by series who didn't actually care to do any research into the community or into the intersex community that it also nicked a bunch of shit from too. Those two words would be stereotypical and confused.
If you're curious.
It doesn't matter, Paul.
At the end of the day, this is just another show using the genderqueer or gender fluid communities as set dressing on a mentally ill person to further add to the illness of them, force its audiences to get horrified by. To further make that normal audience, see how wrong the other people are, a la films like Silence of the Lambs, like I've mentioned a few times. Having us be a trans man serial killer who only transitioned so that they could protect themselves by becoming a man, and then became obsessed with murdering people like their father, a father that they copied in one of their identities, is a usage of trans elements that seeks to demonize us or to isolate us as wrong. The sex change operation being used, the clinic mentioned, all of those are not going to be looked upon favourably by the audience who watched this episode and saw Paul Millander using them in what could be deemed as a wrong way.
And you started to identify with the aggressors.
My mother wouldn't hear it. Against her wishes, I cut off my hair.
Because as far as they're concerned, and as far as CSI might as well be concerned, how can you tell which trans people are doing it for the right reasons and which ones are just like Paul Millander here? You basically can't, and we didn't really give any counterbalances to what we said in this episode. However, there is one more CSI episode that features trans people, an episode that I will be getting around to in its own video at some point in the coming months. Don't you worry. Like I said at the beginning of this video, we're on quite the cop show kick right now for discussing their shit, and we will probably try and get round to all of them by the end of this year. CSI's Identity Crisis is a bad trans episode. It's a bad episode that uses transness as merely a tool for further distancing a serial killer from the audience. And that paints transness in a light that is not going to make those who watch this show react kindly to finding out someone is trans. It also predominantly uses us as an extra sprinkle of twist to put on top of Paul Millander's character development. It's the kind of basic, ground level bad shit you expect from the shows that saw Psycho and Silence of the Lambs and wanted to echo their transphobic sentiments, but with even more solid commentary on the transphobic part. It just sucks.
Paul killed Pauline, but he didn't murder her.
If you enjoyed what I said here, or found it to be educational, or just like my position as decent length YouTube distractions while you do some housework or play a game or build a Magic the Gathering deck, then that's great. It's exactly what I'm aiming to be here on YouTube. The best way to showcase your appreciation is by going to my Patreon and subscribing there, or if you only want to do a one-off payment, going to my Ko-Fi, both of which are linked below. Those in the $5 and up category should be scrolling past the screen right now, and I really appreciate everyone who does fund what I am doing because it helps me to focus on it and focus on my goal of covering all the trans or gender swap or trans-ish rep that exists in media. It's a lengthy Sisyphean task as every year more stuff comes out, but I do think that it provides a service that nobody else is bothering to really do on YouTube. I mean, I discuss a lot of shows and episodes that I've never seen anyone else cover, which should hold some importance to the trans community and people seeking to understand our representation. The money from Patreon goes towards paying for my power, rent, internet, food, and cat bills. The cat being this cat here, Merlin, a frankly little bastard whose main goal in life is using his huge claws to annihilate everything I own. He does provide moral support for the channel though, so I guess it's all worth it. But yeah, huge thanks to everyone who does support me. It goes a long way towards making me feel as if this channel is also something that people want to see so much that they're willing to put money into making it continue. As far as it is currently set up, I have at least enough content to do the next 2 years, and after that we will have to see what's going on and where I can go with it. That's a future problem, and in the here and now though, thank you for watching this video to everyone who did. You can share it with people you think might like it, or you can go and check out some of my other videos. You can also leave a comment with recommendations for what else to cover. I do look at all of them, and I do collate them onto my list of things to eventually get round to at some point. Other than all of that though, I hope you have a great day. And please don't think that every trans person is a serial killer who transitioned for reasons that are not actually about an internal gender identity, but rather about perceptions of how toxic gender stuff might benefit them. That's the takeaway message that I really want people to get here, so, you know, that one.